Hello and welcome to rootsdiscovery.com. I'm your host, Mick. Today we crack the case of James McAvoy of Brooklyn, New York. What we have here is the obituary for James McAvoy. He died on Sunday, January 18th, 1874 in his 49th year. So what this gives us is that he was born loosely around 1825. What we also see is that he had two brother-in-laws. One was a P. McEwen and the other one was a James Clark. But what we also see is that he had a son named Thomas J. McAvoy. According to this researcher who supplied me this information, this came from the 1855 census of New York. What this shows is that James McAvoy was born in Ireland circa 1825, a ship carpenter by trade, had a wife named Margaret, and was in the U.S. for 11 years. Now, I had an actual look myself at the 1855 census of New York, and it was just as supplied to me from another researcher what it was stated to have shown, which was that James McAvoy was 30 years of age in 1855, so this does show that he was born around 1825. His wife Margaret was about 2 years younger than him. But what I'm looking at here is at 11 years, which is stated to have been him being in the U.S. That actually was him being in the city or town. So the 1844 circa year that we're given for him actually being in the country was actually him being in the city or town. I went back to the 1850 census, which was 5 years prior to that previous slide. And here we have James and his wife, Margaret, with their son Thomas and another son named James. What I'm looking at here is the fact that James is now born around 1824, but what I'm also looking at is he has a Thomas. Not only his son is named Thomas, but there is another individual, a Thomas, who was 15 years old. Now, is this his younger brother? But this younger brother is stated to have been born in New York. So if that is the case, and this brother was born around 1835, that means that this James McAvoy was likely to have come over much earlier than 1844. This is the 1860 census of Brooklyn, New York. What it shows is that James McAvoy, the ship carpenter, is now 40 years old. So this puts him born around 1820. His wife Margaret was 4 years younger than him. Thomas was 14, Sarah was 10, and young daughter Josephine was 2 years of age. What this record shows is that James McAvoy of 96 York Street registered for the Civil War in 1863. It states that he is 40 years old, was a foreman, but he was born in New York. What we're looking at here is the 1865 state census of Brooklyn, New York. What this shows is that James McAvoy is 45 years old, and so is his wife. So this puts them at about 1820 as a birth year. The children, Thomas, starting off with him, he was 16 years old, which would put him in about 1849. Sarah would have been born around 1851 since she was listed as 14. And Josephine was 7 years old in 1865 here, so this puts her at around 1858. This is the 1870 census of Brooklyn, New York. James is now widowed. What it states is that he is 56 years old, a printer, not a ship carpenter, but it states he is 56 years old, so he is getting older and older, and this puts him born around 1814. His daughter Sarah is 20 years old, this puts her about 1850. Daughter Josephine is 18 at about 1852 for her birth year. If we look here, this is the 1858 directory of Brooklyn, New York. What we see is that James, the ship carpenter, is living at a place called 50 Talman Street. Remembering back to that Civil War registration, he was living on 96 York. So let's plug that into the map and figure out where these places are. What I found out was the street called Talman was a very narrow and tiny street just south of York Street. It was located in between Pearl and Gold. But again, it is a very tiny street, and what I'm thinking is that perhaps 96 York, which is where James McAvoy lived, could that have been the north end of the building, which was located just by the Manhattan Bridge? And the south part could have been 50 Talman. Here we have the obituary for a Thomas McAvoy. This Thomas McAvoy died on April 2nd of 1844 in his 43rd year. So if this is the case, this Thomas McAvoy would have been a generation removed from that James McAvoy. And what I'm seeing here at the bottom is that his residence was 50 Talman. So is this the father of James McAvoy? And let's keep in mind, he named his first son Thomas. So if James named his first son Thomas, then perhaps he was keeping with tradition in naming the first son after the paternal grandfather. This is the will of Thomas McAvoy, dated April 2nd of 1844. Because this image is a little bit blurry, I'm going to transcribe it on the next slide. This is the will for Thomas McAvoy, once again transcribed. What we have is that Thomas McAvoy was married to a woman named Anne. He had 7 children, starting off with John. John was born around 1822. Son James, born around 1825. Rosanna, born around 1830. Catherine, born around 1832. Thomas, born around 1836. Sarah Jane, born around 1842. And Edward, 4 months in 1844. And this date was in April of 1844. So the question then becomes, who was born in Ireland and who was born in Brooklyn? Well, we know that Thomas stated he was born in Kings County around 1836. So we have to check then if Roseanne and Catherine were born in Ireland or if they were born in Kings County. And thinking back to the obituary for James McAvoy, which was in 1874, it stated that he had a brother-in-law named P. McCune. Well, here he is here. That was Patrick McCune. His wife was Catherine McAvoy. Living with them is sister Rosanna McAvoy. And those dates pretty much match up with what was on Thomas McAvoy's will, their father. But more significant than that is the birthplace of both Catherine and Rosanna. They were both born in New York and not Ireland. So thus far, the only 2 children that were born in Ireland were John and James McAvoy. Now, because of the fact that Thomas McAvoy was living on 50 Talman Street, this puts him within the parish of St. James. So our goal then would to be looking for the children of Thomas McAvoy located at St. James Parish. Before we send off for the baptisms of the children of Thomas McAvoy, we need to specify when these children were actually born. Unfortunately, the only sibling of James McAvoy that I could find was Catherine McCune. Here we see Catherine McCune in the 1900 census of Brooklyn. She states that she was born in August of 1834. So unfortunately, she is the only sibling where I have a birth month, let alone a birth year. Well, this is very, very disappointing because I received only 1 baptism from St. James Parish. And when I received this, I was told how blurry the image was. Well, this does not appear blurry to me at all. I can clearly read this. On the 26th of August, 1833, Catherine McAvoy was born to Thomas McAvoy and his wife, Sarah Hennin. Now, this means that Thomas McAvoy was married prior to marrying Anne. What we also see here is that the sponsors were a John Shields and an Ellen Jeffers. What this record shows is that there was a child born prior to daughter Rosanna. It was a Lawrence McAvoy born on the 13th of August of 1828, and he was baptized 4 days later. What this also shows is that prior to living in Brooklyn, Thomas McAvoy and his wife Sarah were living in New York City. Sarah here is listed as Sarah Heaney, not Hennon, so perhaps they just read the writing wrong. So just trying to get a general idea of where these people came from, I plugged in McAvoy, which was Thomas's name, but then I also plugged in Sarah's name, which was Hennon. Where there is overlap is in the county of Down. The problem here is I was not able to locate their marriage record, nor could I find their two children, John and James, and their baptisms. What this record shows is that the McAvoy family came to New York on the 26th of April, 1827, on the Princess Charlotte that came from Newry, County Down. This is from that same ship, the Princess Charlotte, on the same day. What we have is another McAvoy family. We have a John and his wife Sarah. In looking at this family, the naming patterns are pretty similar to what Thomas and his wife Sarah Hennon named their children. And if we remember back to that 1844 obituary for Thomas McAvoy, it stated that he had a brother named John McAvoy. So perhaps this John McAvoy here on the same ship is his brother. Now, in thumbing through obituaries, I did locate the sister of James McAvoy, and that was Catherine McCune. Catherine here is stated to have had two cousins. One was Arthur, and the other was Peter. Now, if I remember right, I saw a Arthur listed as a son of that John and Sarah, which were on the same ship. So let's see if we can figure out if whether or not that Arthur was the one that was on that ship. This record is from the 9th of February, 1856, and this concerns Arthur McAvoy. What he states to the bank is that he is a native of Ballydrummond, County Down, and that he arrived in March of 1827 on the Princess Charlotte, which was from Newry, County Down. But it also states that his parents are dead and that his father was John and his mother was Sarah Lavery. Here we have another transaction for Arthur. Arthur in 1861 states he was born in 1813, but this time he states he is from Drumgullion, County Down, and again he states that he came over in 1827 on the Princess Charlotte. So we know we have the same person, but what we don't have is any consistency where he was born, because now it says Drumgullion, before it said Ballydrummond. So let's see if we can figure out what he's trying to say. So why is it crucial that we find the birthplace for Arthur McAvoy? Arthur McAvoy would have been the nephew of Thomas McAvoy and Sarah Hennon. Well, the truth of the matter is that a lot of the Irish lived in extended families, and so it is likely that John McAvoy, Thomas McAvoy, the brothers, were all living in the same area. So let's get back to what Arthur McAvoy said when he was having those bank transactions. On the one hand, he states he was born in Drumgullion, which is in Newry, County Down. But the problem here is that is the port. On the other hand, he specifically says he was a native of Ballydrummond. Now that is a road that is in Upper Drumgullion Parish. What I'm thinking Arthur meant was he was from Ballydrummond Road in the parish of Upper Drumgullion. So let's zoom in on that area here. This is Ballydrummond Road in Upper Drumgullion, and to this day there are still McAvoys found there. The conclusion. James McAvoy was born circa 1825, and he arrived in New York City on the 26th of April, 1827, on the Princess Charlotte ship, along with his father Thomas, mother Sarah Hennon, and brother John. He was born in the parish of Upper Drumgooland, County Down, in the area of Ballydrummond Road. James married Margaret McCune, and he resided at 50 Talman Street in the parish of St. James, Brooklyn, New York. If you would like help in finding your Irish roots, contact me at rootsdiscoverycontact@gmail.com. This has been your host, Mick, and I just cracked the case.